The dust had not settled from the Land Rover's tires before the laughter started. A boy no older than 11 stood at the edge of the dry riverbed, his eyes fixed on the sky, tracking a small flock of birds crossing low over the acacia trees. He was barefoot, his shirt patched at the shoulder, a wooden herding stick resting against his leg. Behind him, 4 tourists climbed out of their vehicle, sweating, irritated, already 3 hours behind schedule. One of them, a broad-shouldered American named Grant Whitfield, took one look at the boy staring at the sky and began to laugh. He turned to his wife and said the boy was probably praying to the birds for rain. The guide, a tired man named Elliot Mwangi, tried to explain that the boy was not praying. He was reading something. Nobody listened. Within the hour, the safari's water reserves would fail. Within a day, 2 of the tourists would be lying in the shade too weak to stand, and the only working borehole for 40 miles would already be dry. What none of them understood yet was that the boy staring at the sky held the one piece of knowledge that could save every single one of them, and it had nothing to do with prayer. This was the dry season of 2011, in the flatlands beyond the Kalenga Escarpment, a stretch of East African bush where the rains had failed for the 2nd year in a row. The grass had turned the color of old bone. The riverbeds had cracked into long gray scars across the land. Even the baobabs, trees that could survive almost anything, had begun dropping their leaves early, conserving whatever moisture remained inside their swollen trunks. It was into this land that a private safari convoy had driven that morning, 4 tourists and 1 guide, heading toward a lodge that sat nearly 60 kilometers from the nearest town. The boy's name was Juma. He lived with his grandfather, Ole Santian, in a small homestead of mud-walled huts near the edge of the plains, close enough to the wildlife corridor that lions sometimes crossed within sight of the goat pen at night. Juma's father had been a tracker, one of the best in the region, a man who had guided hunters and later conservationists through terrain that swallowed lesser men whole. He had died 3 years earlier, caught in a flash flood while trying to lead a stranded research team to higher ground. Before he died, he had taught his son one thing above all else. Watch the birds, not for beauty, not for company, but because in a land where water could vanish for months at a time, the birds always knew where the last of it remained. Juma had grown up watching flocks of sandgrouse rise from the plains just before dawn, memorizing the invisible lines that stretched across the bush toward hidden springs and shrinking pools no map would ever show. His grandfather called it an old skill, one fewer young men bothered to learn now that boreholes had made it feel unnecessary. But out here, boreholes broke down, generators failed, and pipes ran dry long before anyone in town noticed. Out here, the birds still mattered. On the morning the tourists arrived, Juma had been herding his grandfather's remaining goats along the dry riverbed, watching a flock of birds lift off the plain in a tight, low formation, angling sharply toward the northeast. He recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same flight line his father had once shown him, the one that led, eventually, to a spring hidden beneath a shelf of volcanic rock nearly 9 kilometers away, a spring so obscure that even some rangers didn't know it existed. He was still watching the birds disappear over the horizon when the safari vehicle rattled to a stop beside him, engine ticking, dust rolling past in a slow orange cloud. Grant Whitfield stepped out first, phone raised, already filming for whatever audience waited back home. His wife, Carol, followed, fanning herself with a paper map that had clearly stopped being useful hours earlier. Behind them came an older couple, the Hendersons, both in their 60s, both already showing the strain of a morning spent inside a vehicle with a broken air conditioning unit. Elliot Mwangi, the guide, climbed out last, rubbing his eyes, glancing at his watch with the expression of a man doing math he did not like. They were lost. Not badly, not yet, but lost enough that the planned 90-minute drive had already stretched past 3 hours, winding through unmarked tracks that all looked the same beneath the flat white sky. Elliot had radioed the lodge twice with no response. The satellite phone had a dead battery, a detail nobody had checked before leaving. Worse, the water containers strapped to the roof, 4 jerry cans meant to last the group well beyond any reasonable delay, had cracked somewhere along the rough track. By the time anyone noticed, more than half their water was already gone into the dust. It was Carol Whitfield who saw Juma first, standing motionless at the edge of the riverbed, head tilted back, eyes tracking something none of them could see. She pointed him out to her husband, half amused, half unsettled by how still he was. Grant walked toward him, phone still raised, already narrating for whatever video he imagined making later. He asked, loudly, slowly, the way people sometimes speak to those they assume won't understand, what the boy was doing. Juma, without lowering his gaze, answered in clear, careful English that his father had insisted he learn. He said he was watching the birds go to water. Grant laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly, more the laugh of a man who found the whole scene amusing. A barefoot boy in the middle of nowhere, claiming birds could tell him anything useful. He turned to the camera and said something about local superstitions, about how charming it was that people out here still believed birds could predict the future. Carol laughed along with him. The Hendersons, standing in the shade of the vehicle, exchanged a tired glance, but said nothing. Elliot, unfolding a paper map against the hood of the Land Rover, did not laugh. He had grown up in a village not far from here. He knew exactly what the boy meant, and he knew exactly how much that knowledge might be worth before the day was over. Subscribe now, because in a few hours, everyone standing at that riverbed would learn just how wrong it is to mock something you don't understand, and the boy they laughed at would be the only person standing between all 4 tourists and a slow, terrible death under the African sun. Elliot tried, carefully, to explain. He told Grant that the boy's father had been a tracker, one of the best trackers the region had ever produced, and that reading bird flight to find water was not superstition at all. It was a skill passed down for generations, one that had saved lives long before satellite phones and marked roads existed. Grant waved a hand, already turning back toward the vehicle. He said they didn't need a folk remedy. They needed directions, and if the guide couldn't provide them, perhaps the lodge would send someone competent to find them instead. The words landed harder than he probably intended. Elliot's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He climbed back behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled the Land Rover back onto the track, leaving Juma standing at the edge of the dry riverbed, goats bleating softly behind him, watching the dust rise as the vehicle disappeared toward the horizon. He did not follow them. He simply watched the direction they drove, noted it did not match the direction the birds had flown, and felt a small, quiet unease settle into his chest, the kind of feeling his father used to describe as the land telling you something before it happened out loud. The Land Rover managed perhaps another 20 minutes before the first real trouble began. The track, already faint, split into 2 directions, neither of which appeared on Elliot's map. He chose the left fork, reasoning it curved more directly toward the lodge. It was the wrong choice. Within another half hour, the track thinned to almost nothing, swallowed by dead grass and volcanic rock, forcing Elliot to slow to a crawl. The temperature outside had climbed past 40 degrees Celsius. Inside the cabin, without working air conditioning, it felt closer to an oven. Carol Whitfield was the first to complain about thirst, reaching for one of the remaining water bottles only to find it nearly empty, most of its contents lost hours earlier to the cracked containers on the roof. Grant checked the others. What remained, spread across 4 adults and 1 exhausted guide, amounted to less than 2 liters total. Not enough, by any reasonable estimate, to last the rest of the day, let alone another night if they remained lost. It was Mrs. Henderson who began showing the first real signs of trouble, her face flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she fanned herself with increasingly weak motions. Her husband asked if she was all right. She said she was fine, the way people often do, right before they are not fine at all. Elliot glanced at her in the rearview mirror and felt the same unease Juma had felt back at the riverbed, except now it had a name, and that name was heat stroke. And heat stroke, out here, with no clean water and no clear road back to anywhere, was not something to take lightly. He pulled the vehicle to a stop beneath the meager shade of a lone acacia tree, its branches thin and half bare from the drought, offering barely enough relief to matter. He stepped out, studied the horizon in every direction, and found nothing familiar. No landmark, no distant rooftop, no radio tower catching the afternoon light. Just flat, dry, endless bush stretching in every direction, shimmering under heat that seemed to bend the very air. For the first time since the trip began, Elliot allowed himself to consider, seriously, that they might not find their way back before dark, and that the boy he had left standing at the riverbed might be the only person for miles who actually knew where water could be found. He turned the vehicle around. Juma was still at the riverbed when the Land Rover reappeared, this time moving faster than before, throwing up a long tail of orange dust behind it. He had not moved far. He had let the goats drift toward a patch of shade near a dead fig tree and simply waited, watching the empty horizon the way his father had taught him to watch a fire that had not yet decided whether it would spread. When the vehicle skidded to a stop beside him, for the second time that day, he was not surprised. He had expected them to come back eventually. He had simply hoped it would not take heat stroke to bring them. Elliot climbed out first, and this time there was no irritation left in his face, only urgency. He crouched to Juma's height, an old habit from years of guiding children through the bush, and asked him directly whether he could still see the direction the birds had flown that morning. Juma nodded. He said the flock always followed the same path this time of year, out toward the volcanic shelf past the dead marula grove, where a spring ran beneath the rock even when everything above ground had turned to dust. He said his father used to call it the hidden water, because from a distance it looked like nothing at all, just broken stone and thorn scrub, the kind of place a stranger would drive straight past without a second glance. Grant Whitfield stepped out of the vehicle more slowly, one hand pressed against his lower back, his earlier confidence noticeably thinner than it had been that morning. He looked at Juma, then at Elliot, then toward the back seat where Mrs. Henderson sat slumped against the window, her face pale beneath a layer of sweat, her breathing shallow and quick. Whatever pride had fueled his laughter earlier had begun to crack under the simple, undeniable fact that his wife's traveling companion looked dangerously close to collapse, and none of his money, his phone, or his opinions about local superstition could fix that. He asked, quietly this time, how far the water was. Juma said it depended on how fast they walked, and how much the ground allowed the vehicle to travel before it became too rocky to continue. He said the spring was roughly 9 kilometers from where they stood, but the last stretch, closer to the shelf, could not be driven. It would have to be walked. Grant asked if the boy was certain. Juma said the birds were never wrong about water, only about how easy it would be to reach it. Elliot did not wait for further discussion. He helped Mrs. Henderson sip the last careful mouthful of water from the nearly empty bottle, propped a folded jacket behind her head, and told Mr. Henderson to keep her in the shade and keep talking to her, keep her alert, no matter how tired she felt. Then he turned to Juma and asked, plainly, if he would come with them and show the way. Juma glanced back at the goats, drifting slowly toward the shade of the fig tree, and then toward his grandfather's homestead, invisible somewhere beyond the low rise to the south. He knew Ole Santian would worry if he did not return by dusk. He also knew that a woman was dying slowly in the back seat of a stranger's vehicle, and that knowledge outweighed everything else. He said yes. The vehicle carried them as far as the terrain allowed, bouncing over sun-baked ruts and loose stone, following a route Juma called out from the back seat, correcting Elliot's steering with quiet, confident instructions that surprised even Grant, who had spent the morning dismissing everything the boy said. Twice they had to stop and clear fallen branches from the track. Once they nearly lost a tire in a hidden gully, the kind of hazard that would have been invisible to anyone unfamiliar with how dry season erosion carved the land beneath its surface. Juma spotted it 30 meters out, before Elliot even slowed down. Subscribe now, because the next stretch of this journey would test every ounce of trust these strangers had left. forcing 4 exhausted adults to follow a barefoot boy across terrain that had already claimed the life of his own father. And by the time the sun reached its highest point, at least one of them would begin to wonder whether they were being led toward salvation or straight into the same disaster that took him. Eventually, the track disappeared entirely, swallowed by a wide stretch of broken volcanic rubble that stretched toward a low, dark ridge in the distance. Elliot stopped the vehicle beneath what shade remained from a lone thorn tree and killed the engine. From here, Juma explained, they would have to walk. He estimated the remaining distance at just under 3 kilometers, difficult ground, uneven and hot, but passable if they moved carefully and rationed what little water remained. Mrs. Henderson could not walk easily. Her husband and Elliot supported her between them, her arms draped over their shoulders, her steps small and unsteady across the loose stone. Grant carried what remained of their water and a small first aid kit from the vehicle, while Carol walked close beside Juma, watching him with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last hour, from amusement into something closer to careful respect. She asked him, at one point, how he could be so certain about a flock of birds he could no longer even see. Juma explained, in his careful, unhurried English, that the birds did not need to be visible anymore. He knew their pattern. He knew the shape of the land they preferred, low ground near stone, shaded from the worst of the afternoon heat, close enough to cover that predators rarely lingered there for long. Water attracted everything, he said. Birds, antelope, sometimes worse. That was simply how the bush worked. The heat by early afternoon had become almost unbearable, radiating up from the black volcanic rock in visible waves, distorting the horizon into something that shimmered and bent. Grant, despite his earlier bravado, had gone quiet, his shirt soaked through, his breathing labored in a way that worried Elliot more than he let on. Carol stumbled twice on the uneven ground, catching herself both times on Juma's outstretched arm, an arm far smaller than her own, but somehow steady enough to hold her weight. They stopped twice to rest in whatever thin shade the terrain offered, rationing sips of water so small they barely qualified as relief. During the second stop, Mr. Henderson admitted, quietly, to Elliot, that his wife had a heart condition, one she had not mentioned before the trip, because she did not want to be treated differently. The admission changed the tone of the group immediately. What had been an uncomfortable inconvenience an hour earlier now felt like a genuine race against something none of them could see coming, not until it was already too late. Juma listened to this without comment, but something in his expression sharpened. He asked how long ago her symptoms had started. When Mr. Henderson answered, Juma did a quick calculation in his head, the kind of calculation his father had once shown him, for judging how much time remained before a stranded traveler crossed from dangerous into fatal. He said carefully that they needed to move faster than he had originally planned. He said there was a shorter route, one his father had shown him only once, steeper and harder on the legs, but nearly a full kilometer less than the path he had first intended to take. Elliot asked why he had not suggested it from the start. Juma admitted, honestly, that the shorter route crossed closer to a section of thicker brush where predators sometimes rested during the hottest part of the day, and he had wanted to avoid that risk if there was time to spare. Now, watching Mrs. Henderson's increasingly shallow breathing, he no longer believed there was time to spare. Grant, hearing this, asked directly whether the shorter route was dangerous. Juma did not soften the answer the way an adult might have, trying to manage a tourist's fear. He simply told the truth, the way his father had always told him the truth about the land. Because lies about danger got people killed faster than honesty ever did. He said it was more dangerous than the long way, but slower would be more dangerous still, given how Mrs. Henderson looked right now. The choice, he said, belonged to them, not to him. There was a long, heavy silence, broken only by the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the ridge, a sound Juma recognized immediately, sharp and repetitive, unmistakably close to where he expected the flock to be resting near the spring. He looked toward the sound, then back at the group, and said quietly that the birds were near. That meant the water was near too. but near, on ground like this, in heat like this, with a woman whose heart could not be trusted to hold out much longer, still meant nearly an hour of walking through terrain that offered no guarantees. Elliot looked at Mr. Henderson, who looked at his wife, pale and trembling despite the heat, her eyes half closed. He did not need to ask her opinion. He simply nodded. They took the shorter route. The shorter route climbed almost immediately, cutting across a shoulder of broken rock that forced the group into single file, Juma leading, Elliot and Mr. Henderson supporting Mrs. Henderson between them, Grant and Carol close behind. The brush thickened here, low and brittle with drought, tall enough in places to hide anything that did not want to be seen. Juma moved slower now, not from fatigue, but from caution, scanning the ground for tracks the way his father had taught him. He stopped once, raising a hand without turning around, and the group froze. He had seen prints crossing the trail at an angle, fresh enough that the edges had not yet crumbled in the heat. "Lion," he said quietly, his voice steady in a way that unsettled Carol more than panic would have. "Not close. Moving away from the water, not toward it." He waited a moment, then continued forward, choosing a slightly wider path around the crossing, giving whatever animal had passed there room enough to feel unthreatened. Grant, walking near the back, asked in a low voice whether they should turn back. Elliot answered before Juma could, his tone firm. Turning back meant another hour in this heat, with a woman whose heart was already struggling. Continuing meant perhaps 20 more minutes to water, shade, and safety. There was no version of turning back that improved their odds. Grant did not argue again. The ground grew rockier as they climbed, forcing Mr. Henderson and Elliot to half-carry his wife over the worst sections. Her breathing had grown shallower, her skin cool and clammy despite the heat, a combination Elliot recognized as dangerous, the body beginning to shut down its own cooling system in a final effort to protect itself. He did not say this aloud. He simply moved faster, urging the group forward with quiet, controlled urgency. Subscribe now, because in the next few minutes, everything this family had assumed about the boy they mocked that morning would be tested one final time, and the answer waiting for them on the other side of this ridge would silence every doubt they carried into the bush that day. Juma reached the top of the rise first and stopped, scanning the shallow basin below. What he saw confirmed everything he had believed since dawn. A shelf of dark volcanic rock curved along the base of the slope, and beneath it, tucked into a shaded crevice barely visible from a distance, a narrow pool of water caught the afternoon light, fed by a thin trickle seeping from deep within the stone. Around its edges, a small flock of sand grouse startled and lifted into the air, scattering briefly before circling back to land nearby, unwilling to abandon the only water for many kilometers. A pair of dik-dik antelope froze at the water's edge, then bolted into the brush. Fresh tracks overlapped in the damp mud, telling a story Juma read easily. Everything out here came to this place eventually. It was, exactly as his father had once told him, the only water. He turned back to the group and said simply, "We are here." What followed happened quickly. Elliot and Mr. Henderson lowered Mrs. Henderson into the shade beneath the rock shelf, her legs unable to hold her weight any longer. Elliot soaked a cloth in the cool spring water and pressed it against her neck and wrists, the fastest way to bring her body temperature down without shocking her system. Carol knelt beside her, holding her hand, speaking softly and steadily. Grant, for the first time all day, moved without hesitation, filling an empty bottle with water and offering it first to Mrs. Henderson, small, careful sips, enough to help without overwhelming her. Juma stayed near the water's edge, watching the birds settle back into their routine now that the threat of the group's arrival had passed. He filled the remaining bottles methodically, the way his father had shown him, upstream of where anyone waded, letting sediment settle before drawing water near the surface. He explained, without being asked, that the spring ran shallow but steady, fed by an underground channel, carrying moisture from higher ground many kilometers away, one of perhaps 3 such sources within a full day's walk in any direction. Most people would never find it. Most people did not know to look for the birds. Mrs. Henderson's color began returning within 20 minutes, her breathing slowing, her grip on Carol's hand growing steadier. She was not fully recovered, not by any measure, but the immediate danger had passed, and everyone in that small, shaded basin understood exactly how close it had come to going the other way. It was Grant who finally spoke, sitting back against the volcanic rock, staring at the water, and then at Juma, who was crouched nearby, refilling another container with quiet, unhurried focus. He said quietly that he owed the boy an apology. He explained, his voice rougher than it had been that morning, that he had laughed at something he did not understand, had dismissed knowledge that had just saved his wife's traveling companion's life, and worse, had done it in front of a boy who deserved better than mockery for keeping a skill alive that adults twice his size had completely forgotten how to use. He said he had spent his whole life assuming that anything worth knowing came wrapped in a diploma or a satellite signal, and that assumption had nearly gotten someone killed today. Juma did not know quite what to say to that. He was 11 years old, and adults rarely apologized to him for anything. He simply nodded and said that his father used to say the land did not care what anyone believed about it, only what they understood. Grant repeated the phrase quietly to himself, as if trying to memorize it. Elliot, checking Mrs. Henderson's pulse a final time, allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first real one of the day. He had grown up watching outsiders arrive in this land, convinced their money and technology made them safer than the people who had survived here for generations without either. What made today different, he thought, was that this time, the lesson had landed before it cost anyone their life, and that was not something he could say about every story he had witnessed out here. They stayed at the spring for nearly 2 hours, resting in the shade while Mrs. Henderson recovered enough strength for the walk back. Juma used the time to show Carol and Grant the tracks scattered around the water's edge, explaining which animals visited at dawn, which came only after dark, how the birds always arrived first, because they needed the least water and could afford to be careless about timing in a way larger animals could not. Grant listened to all of it, asking questions instead of laughing, present in a way he had not managed to be all morning. When they finally began the walk back, Elliot radioed the lodge on a stronger signal picked up near the ridge, and within an hour a rescue vehicle met them part way, carrying fresh water, a stretcher for Mrs. Henderson, and a doctor who confirmed what Elliot had already suspected, that she had come dangerously close to a severe heat-related cardiac event. Before Juma returned home that evening, walking the last stretch alone under a sky turning orange with sunset, Grant pressed something into his hand, not money, though he offered that too and Juma quietly refused it, but a small notebook and pen, insisting the boy deserved to have his father's knowledge written down somewhere. It could never be lost. Juma accepted the notebook. He did not fully understand yet what it would come to mean, but something in the gesture felt right. Ole Santian was waiting at the edge of the homestead when Juma finally walked into view, goats trailing behind him in the fading light. He did not ask where his grandson had been. He simply studied the boy's face for a long moment, the particular stillness Juma's father used to wear after a long day of difficult work, and said only that he looked like a man who had done something his father would have been proud of. Juma told him everything that evening, sitting beside the fire while his grandfather listened without interrupting, nodding at details that clearly reminded him of his own son, gone 3 years now but somehow present in every choice Juma had made that day. Word of what happened traveled quickly through the small network of guides and lodges scattered across the region, the way stories do where radio signals are unreliable, but human memory is not. Within weeks, Elliot found himself fielding requests from other guides, asking whether the boy from the Kalenga flatlands might teach a few basic tracking skills to newer staff, skills that had nearly vanished from common practice as boreholes and marked roads made them feel unnecessary, right up until the moment they suddenly were not. Juma agreed, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, as he realized how much of what his father had taught him still mattered, not as folklore, but as knowledge that could mean the difference between a good story and a tragedy. Grant Whitfield and his wife returned to the region twice more over the following years, each time seeking Juma out specifically, each time listening more than they spoke. On their second visit, Grant admitted something he had never said aloud before, that the morning he laughed at a barefoot boy watching birds had quietly become the moment he thought back to most often when making decisions in his own life, a reminder that confidence without understanding was simply arrogance wearing a more comfortable name. Mrs. Henderson lived many more years after that afternoon at the spring, and every year on the anniversary of the day her life was saved, she sent a letter to the small lodge nearest the Kalenga escarpment, addressed simply to the boy who watched the birds, thanking him for a lesson she never forgot. That the most valuable knowledge in the world rarely announces itself with credentials, and sometimes it stands quietly at the edge of a dry riverbed, waiting for someone humble enough to ask instead of laugh. Juma grew into one of the most respected trackers in the region, eventually training rangers and guides from across the country, always beginning each lesson the same way his father had begun with him, by asking his students to simply watch the birds and to understand that the answer to nearly every hard question the land could ask had already been written across the sky, for anyone patient enough to read it. This story is a tribute to the peoples of the African Savanna, such as the Maasai, and many other communities that have preserved ancestral knowledge passed down from generation to generation. A wisdom built through observing nature and respecting life, knowledge that continues to save lives to this day. May this story remind us that arrogance closes doors, while respect saves lives. If you enjoy inspiring and emotional stories filled with meaningful life lessons, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and join us for more stories like this.